On the night of March 26, 1945, approximately 300 men crossed into German-held territory with orders that none of them fully understood. Their commander was Captain Abraham Baum, 24 years old, from the Bronx, New York. He had been given command of what the Third Army was calling a task force: 10 Sherman tanks, 6 light tanks, 27 half-tracks, and the men to operate them. The mission, as it had been explained to him in a briefing he later described as oddly incomplete, was to drive approximately 60 miles behind German lines and liberate a POW camp near the town of Hammelburg. He had asked for the details that every commander needed before sending 300 men into enemy territory. He had not received all of them. The column moved east in the dark. Baum had a map and a destination, and a force that was not, as he understood from the beginning, large enough for what it was being asked to do. A 60-mile penetration behind enemy lines, through territory the Third Army had not yet reached, through German units that were not aware they were supposed to give way. This was not a standard operational task. The men in the half-tracks behind him were experienced soldiers. They knew the arithmetic of the mission. Some of them asked questions. The questions did not get satisfying answers. What nobody told Captain Abraham Baum on the night of March 26, 1945, was why General George S. Patton needed that specific camp opened. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Let me back up a second, because the story of Task Force Baum is one of the most analyzed and disputed episodes of Patton's command. Disputed precisely because the explanation that was given and the explanation that was true were not the same explanation, and the distance between them was measured in the men who didn't come home. Oflag XIII-B was a German prisoner-of-war camp near Hammelburg in Bavaria. By March of 1945, it held a substantial population of Allied prisoners, American officers in the main, captured at various points in the North African and Italian campaigns, and the fighting in France and Germany. They had been in German captivity for months, some of them for years. The official justification for Task Force Baum, the one that appeared in the mission orders and that Patton offered to his superiors when asked, was that the raid was a diversionary operation designed to confuse the German rear area, to disrupt enemy logistics, and to prevent the execution of Allied prisoners that intelligence suggested the Germans might plan as the front collapsed around them. It was a plausible justification. There were genuine concerns about what German guards might do to their prisoners as the Allied armies closed in. The liberation of POW camps was a legitimate military objective. What the justification did not mention was the specific name that the Third Army's intelligence section had added to its list of men held at Oflag XIII-B. Lieutenant Colonel John K. Waters. Now, here's the thing. John Waters was a capable officer who had served in North Africa and been captured in Tunisia in February 1943. He had been a prisoner of war for more than 2 years. He was also, by the time Task Force Baum was being assembled, the husband of Patton's daughter Beatrice. He was Patton's son-in-law. The marriage had taken place in 1935, a decade before the war reached this moment, before any of this was foreseeable, and Waters had served with distinction before his capture. He was not a man who required special circumstances to be worth rescuing. He was an American officer, a prisoner of war, and his liberation was a legitimate military goal alongside the liberation of every other officer in that camp. But he was also specifically and personally and by blood connected to the commanding general of the Third Army. And the commanding general had organized a task force of 300 men and sent it 60 miles behind enemy lines to the camp where his son-in-law was being held. And the commanding general had not, in any official statement, acknowledged that his son-in-law was in the camp. Picture it. The task force moving through the German countryside in the dark. German units, surprised and disorganized, but responding the way defending forces always eventually respond to a penetration of their rear area. Baum and his men fighting their way east through checkpoints and roadblocks, and the improvised resistance of soldiers who had not expected American armor 60 miles from the front. The toll accumulating at every exchange. The task force losing vehicles, losing men. It had not been large enough for the mission when it started. It was becoming less large with every mile. They reached Hammelburg on the afternoon of March 27th. The gates of Oflag XIII-B were opened. More than 1,000 Allied prisoners were suddenly in the courtyard, in varying states of physical condition, looking at American tanks and American soldiers who had come, impossibly, inconceivably, to get them out. Here's what doesn't make it into the history books. John Waters walked toward the gate in the chaos of the liberation and was shot by a German guard. The wound was serious, but not immediately fatal. A German medical officer was brought in to treat him. Waters was stabilized, but could not be moved. He was back in German hands in the camp, while Baum's men tried to organize the exodus of hundreds of prisoners who were now walking into the German countryside alongside the retreating American column. And this is where it gets complicated. The task force, already damaged before it reached Hammelburg, now had a column of sick and weakened prisoners stretched out behind it, and the full attention of the German forces in the area. The return journey was not 60 miles of confused and surprised defenders. It was 60 miles of German units that had had time to organize a response. Baum's column was ambushed, then ambushed again. The tanks fell one by one, the half-tracks, the men. Captain Abraham Baum was wounded. He was captured. Of the approximately 300 men who had crossed into German territory on the night of March 26th, 32 were killed. Most of the remainder were captured. Approximately 16 made it back to American lines. The prisoners who had walked out of Oflag XIII-B with the task force were, for the most part, recaptured within days. Waters survived. He was eventually liberated when American forces reached Hammelburg several weeks later and found him in the camp infirmary, being kept alive by the German medical officer who had treated him after the shooting. Stay with me, because what happened next, what Patton said when the full dimensions of the disaster became clear, is the piece of this story that has never been fully resolved. Eisenhower was furious. The accounts of that conversation agree on their character. Eisenhower regarded the Hammelburg raid as a serious error of judgment, a misuse of command authority, a gamble with men's lives that had gone catastrophically wrong. He reportedly considered relieving Patton, and did not. The war was in its final weeks, and replacing the Third Army's commander at that moment was its own kind of risk. The decision was made to let it pass. Patton's public position was that the raid had been a legitimate tactical operation with a legitimate military objective. He maintained that its purpose was the liberation of Allied prisoners and the disruption of German rear area forces. He denied that his son-in-law's presence at Hammelburg had been a factor in the decision. He said this clearly to multiple audiences on multiple occasions, in a manner that made it clear he intended it to be the record. His private diary, published after his death, contained a specific notation about Waters being at Hammelburg before the raid was mounted. The notation made it clear that Patton knew. He knew who was in the camp when he sent 300 men to open it. Think about that for a second. The gap between what he knew and what he said. The 300 men who were not told the full reason for the mission they were ordered to execute. The 32 who did not come back. And the general who, when asked directly about the personal dimension of the decision, said it wasn't there. See, what most folks don't realize is that this is not simply a story about nepotism, though nepotism is part of it. It is a story about what a commander owes to the men under his command when the line between personal and professional has been crossed. The men of Task Force Baum signed up to follow orders into danger. That is what soldiers do. They do it with the understanding, implicit and foundational to the entire enterprise, that the orders reflect military necessity and not the commanding general's family situation. Baum asked for information he was not given. The men in the half-tracks asked questions that did not receive satisfying answers. They went anyway, because that is what soldiers do. Private Edward Mosher, 19 years old, from Marion, Ohio, was one of the 32 who did not come back. He had been drafted in the fall of 1943, trained at Fort Knox, and assigned to the 3rd Army's Cavalry in time for the push into Germany. He had a mother named Ruth and a father who worked at the Shovel Company in Marion, and a younger brother named Carl who was finishing high school. He had been in Germany for 3 months before March 26, 1945. He had not been told why Hammelburg specifically required the force being assembled to reach it. He had been told what soldiers are always told, that the objective is military, that the need is urgent, that the mission matters. He crossed the line of departure in the dark and did not come back across it. 31 others went with him. And the man who sent them maintained, for the rest of his life, that the decision was purely military. Baum, who recovered from his wounds and was liberated when American forces reached his POW camp, was asked about Hammelburg for years afterward. He was asked whether he believed the personal motivation had been there. He said yes. He was asked whether he was angry. The answers he gave were more complicated than yes or no, because he had been in combat long enough to know that the difference between a good decision and a bad one is sometimes only the outcome, and because time in a prisoner camp had given him a perspective on liberation that was not straightforwardly clean. He did not pretend the mission had gone well. He did not pretend the men who died had died for the reason they were told. The camp at Hammelburg was liberated by American forces on April 6, 1945. John Waters was found in the infirmary. He survived the war, went on to a distinguished military career, and retired as a 4-star general. He never, in any public statement, directly accused his father-in-law of having put men at risk for personal reasons. Patton died in December 1945 in a vehicle accident in Germany, before any official accounting of the Hammelburg decision was completed. The gap between the diary and the public record closed with him. The line of departure is still there on the map. The route east from the 3rd Army's position to Oflag XIII-B is still there on the map. The 32 names are on a record somewhere, attached to the mission that was given a justification that was not the full justification, ordered by a man who had a reason he would not name, and who maintained, publicly, that the reason was not there. Was Patton wrong to send 300 men to Hammelburg without disclosing the personal dimension of the order, and to deny it afterward? Some would say yes, that a commander who uses his authority for personal ends and then lies about it has broken the foundational compact between command and soldier, that 32 men are the price of that breach, and that no operational justification covers what was actually done. Others would say the question is harder than that every deep raid carries the same arithmetic of risk and loss, that the camp held more than Waters alone, that the liberation of Allied prisoners was a legitimate military goal regardless of private motivation, and that what Patton concealed was not the mission, but the personal dimension of why he chose this mission over others. That the distinction matters, even if it is uncomfortable. Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.